Sarah Henderson clutched her medical bag tighter as she stepped off the dusty stagecoach in the small Oregon frontier town of Linkville. The year was 1873, and the recent Modoc War had left deep scars across the land and its people. She had come here as a traveling nurse, drawn by reports of wounded soldiers and displaced families needing medical care. The town was smaller than she had imagined, with wooden buildings lining a single main street. Dust swirled in the afternoon wind, and she could see the distant mountains where the Modoc people had made their final stand. The locals watched her with curious eyes as she made her way toward the makeshift hospital that had been set up in the old church. Dr. William Morrison greeted her at the door. He was a tired-looking man in his 40s with graying hair and kind eyes that had seen too much suffering. "Miss Henderson, I presume. Thank goodness you've arrived. We have more patients than we can handle, and frankly, I could use all the help I can get." Sarah nodded, following him inside. The church had been transformed into a medical facility, with rows of beds occupied by wounded soldiers, settlers, and even some Native Americans who had been caught in the crossfire. The smell of carbolic acid and bandages filled the air, mixed with the quiet moans of the injured. "Most of these men will recover," Dr. Morrison explained as they walked between the beds, "but we have some difficult cases. The war has left many families broken, and we're dealing with more than just physical wounds." As they reached the far end of the church, Sarah noticed a small figure huddled in the corner. It was a Native American child, a girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. She sat perfectly still, her dark eyes staring at nothing, her small hands folded in her lap. "That's Little Moon," Dr. Morrison said quietly. "She's Modoc. Her family was killed during the fighting, and she hasn't spoken a word since the soldiers brought her here 3 weeks ago. We've tried everything, but she won't eat properly, won't interact with anyone. I'm worried about her." Sarah felt her heart tighten. She had seen trauma before, but there was something about this child that touched her deeply. "Has anyone tried to communicate with her in her own language?" "We don't have anyone here who speaks Modoc," the doctor replied. "Most of the tribe has been relocated or—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Sarah understood. That evening, after helping with the other patients, Sarah found herself drawn back to Little Moon. The child hadn't moved from her spot in the corner. Still sitting with that same distant stare, Sarah approached slowly, not wanting to frighten her. "Hello?" she said softly, settling down on the floor a few feet away. "My name is Sarah." Little Moon didn't respond, but Sarah noticed her eyes flicker slightly. It was the first sign of awareness she had shown since Sarah's arrival. "I know you've been through something terrible," Sarah continued, her voice gentle. "I can't imagine how scared and alone you must feel." For the next hour, Sarah simply sat with the child, occasionally speaking in soothing tones but mostly just being present. She had learned in her nursing training that sometimes the most powerful medicine was simply human companionship. The next morning, Sarah brought Little Moon a bowl of warm soup. To her surprise, the child accepted it and ate a few spoonfuls. It wasn't much, but it was progress. Dr. Morrison was encouraged by this small breakthrough. "You seem to have a natural way with her," he told Sarah. "Perhaps you should continue working with her while you're here." Sarah agreed readily. Over the following days, she spent every free moment with Little Moon. She would sit beside her, tell her stories, and gradually began to see small signs of response. The child would sometimes look directly at her now, and once, Sarah thought she saw the beginning of a smile. On her 5th day in Linkville, Sarah was reading aloud from a book of poetry when she heard a soft sound. Little Moon had made a small noise, almost like a sigh. Sarah looked up to find the child watching her intently. "Did you say something, sweetheart?" Sarah asked gently. Little Moon opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. But her eyes remained fixed on Sarah's face with an intensity that was almost startling. That evening, Dr. Morrison approached Sarah with a concerned expression. "I've been thinking about Little Moon's situation," he said. "The territorial government is making arrangements for all the remaining Modoc children. They're going to be sent to a boarding school back east where they'll be educated in white ways." Sarah felt a chill run through her. She had heard about these schools where Native children were forbidden to speak their own languages or practice their customs. The idea of Little Moon being sent to such a place filled her with dread. "When?" she asked. "Next week, possibly sooner. The paperwork is already being processed." That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Little Moon. Alone and traumatized, being sent even further from everything she had ever known. The child had just begun to show signs of healing, and now she would be torn away again. The next morning, Sarah found little Moon in her usual spot, but something was different. The child was watching the door as if waiting for someone. When Sarah approached, little Moon looked up at her with those dark, expressive eyes. "Sarah," she whispered. It was the first word she had spoken since arriving at the hospital. Sarah's heart leaped. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm here." Little Moon reached out and took Sarah's hand. Her small fingers were cold but strong. "Will you stay?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I'll stay as long as I can," Sarah promised, though the words felt inadequate. That afternoon, while Sarah was changing bandages for a soldier, she heard a commotion near Little Moon's corner. She rushed over to find the child standing for the first time in weeks, tears streaming down her face. Dr. Morrison was there too, looking troubled. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I just received word. They're coming for her tomorrow morning." Little Moon looked from Dr. Morrison to Sarah, understanding passing across her face even though they had spoken in English. She had learned enough words during her time there to know what was happening. Sarah knelt down to Little Moon's level, her own eyes filling with tears. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart." Little Moon stepped closer and wrapped her small arms around Sarah's neck. In her ear, she whispered words that would change everything. "Will you be my father's wife?" Sarah pulled back in surprise, looking into the child's serious face. Little Moon continued in her halting English. "My father, in spirit world now, but he told me, in dream, find new mother. You could be, if you marry someone." "Then I stay?" The innocent question hit Sarah like a physical blow. This child, in her desperation and wisdom beyond her years, had found what she believed might be the only way to avoid being sent away. Sarah looked around desperately, her mind racing, knowing that tomorrow would come all too soon. Sarah stared at Little Moon in shock, the child's innocent question echoing in her mind. The idea was impossible, wasn't it? Yet as she looked into those hopeful dark eyes, she felt her heart breaking at the thought of this traumatized child being sent away to a distant boarding school. "Sweetheart," Sarah began carefully, "it's not that simple. Marriage isn't something that can happen quickly, and even if it could, there would have to be someone willing to—" "Dr. Morrison," Little Moon interrupted, her voice stronger now that she had found words again. "He is kind man, no wife." "You like him, I see." Sarah felt her cheeks burn. It was true that she had developed a respect and growing fondness for Dr. Morrison during her time in Linkville, but she had never imagined anything beyond their professional relationship. The man was dedicated to his work, seemingly married to medicine itself. That evening, Sarah found herself unable to concentrate on her duties. Every time she looked at Little Moon, she saw the desperate hope in the child's eyes. The girl had been through unimaginable loss, and now she was grasping at the only solution her young mind could conceive. Dr. Morrison noticed Sarah's distraction as they worked together to treat a soldier's infected wound. "You seem troubled tonight," he observed. "Is it about Little Moon's departure tomorrow?" Sarah hesitated, then decided to be direct. "She asked me something today, something that caught me completely off guard." "Oh?" Dr. Morrison raised an eyebrow as he carefully cleaned the wound. "She asked if I would become her father's wife. She thinks that if I marry someone, she could stay and be part of a family instead of being sent to the boarding school." Dr. Morrison's hands stilled for a moment. "I see. And what did you tell her?" "I tried to explain that it wasn't possible, but William—" Sarah realized she had used his first name and felt herself blushing again. "Dr. Morrison, I mean. She's so desperate and she's just a child. She doesn't understand the complexities of adult relationships and legal arrangements." They worked in silence for several minutes before Dr. Morrison spoke again. "Actually, it might not be as impossible as you think." Sarah looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" "From a legal standpoint, if a married couple were to formally adopt Little Moon, the territorial authorities might allow her to stay rather than send her to the boarding school. The paperwork would be complicated, but it could be done. But that would require a married couple willing to take on such a responsibility," Sarah pointed out. Dr. Morrison nodded slowly. "Indeed it would." They finished treating the soldier and moved on to other patients, but Sarah's mind was spinning. Was Dr. Morrison suggesting what she thought he was suggesting? The idea was preposterous, yet as the evening wore on, she found herself considering it more seriously. Later that night, after the last patient had been settled, Dr. Morrison approached Sarah as she was preparing to retire to her small room above the general store. "Miss Henderson," he said formally, "might I have a word with you privately?" They stepped outside into the cool night air. The stars were brilliant overhead, and Sarah could hear the distant sound of a coyote calling from the hills. "I've been thinking about our conversation earlier," Dr. Morrison began, "about Little Moon's situation and her rather unconventional suggestion." Sarah waited, her heart beating faster. "I want you to know that I hold you in the highest regard," he continued. "Your skill as a nurse, your compassion for the patients, and especially your kindness toward Little Moon have been remarkable to witness." "Thank you," Sarah said quietly, still unsure where this conversation was heading. "What I'm about to suggest may sound presumptuous, and please know that I would completely understand if you found it inappropriate," Dr. Morrison said, his voice careful and measured. "But I've been wondering if perhaps we might consider a practical arrangement that could benefit all three of us." Sarah's breath caught. "An arrangement? A marriage of convenience, if you will. I'm 42 years old, Miss Henderson, and I've devoted my life to medicine. I never expected to marry, but I recognize that there could be mutual benefits to such a union. You're an excellent nurse, and this community desperately needs medical care. I could use a reliable partner in my practice." Sarah stared at him, hardly believing what she was hearing. "And Little Moon," he continued, "well, she needs a family, a stable home where she can heal from her trauma and learn to trust again. I believe you've already begun that process with her." "Dr. Morrison," Sarah began, but he held up a hand. "Please hear me out completely before you respond. I'm not speaking of a romantic arrangement, you understand. I'm talking about a partnership based on mutual respect and shared purpose. We could provide Little Moon with the family she needs, and you could continue your nursing work in a place where it's desperately needed." Sarah felt overwhelmed. The proposal was practical, even logical, but it was also the most unusual thing anyone had ever suggested to her. "You would be willing to do this?" she asked. "To marry someone you barely know just to help a child?" Dr. Morrison was quiet for a moment. "Miss Henderson, I've seen a lot of suffering in my years as a doctor. I've watched children die from diseases that could have been prevented, seen families torn apart by war and poverty. But I've also seen acts of incredible kindness and sacrifice. What you've done for Little Moon these past weeks, the way you've brought her back from the edge of despair, tells me everything I need to know about your character." He paused, looking up at the stars. "Besides, I don't think this would be just about helping a child. I think it could be a good life for all of us." Sarah found herself thinking about her own life, her own loneliness. She had always thrown herself into her work, caring for others while neglecting her own needs for companionship and stability. The idea of having a partner in her medical work, of helping to raise Little Moon, of building something meaningful in this frontier community, held an unexpected appeal. "I would need time to think about this," she said finally. "Of course, but unfortunately time is something we don't have much of. The officials will be here first thing in the morning to collect Little Moon." As if summoned by their conversation, they heard the soft sound of footsteps. Little Moon appeared in the doorway of the church, her small figure silhouetted against the lamplight from inside. "Sarah?" she called softly. "I have bad dream. You come sit with me." Sarah looked at Dr. Morrison, then hurried to the child's side. Little Moon took her hand and led her back inside to the corner where she had spent so many silent days. "I dream about the boarding school," Little Moon whispered as they sat together. "Big building with no windows. Children crying for their mothers. They make us forget our names, our people." Sarah felt tears sting her eyes. She had heard similar stories from other children who had been sent to such institutions. "Sarah," Little Moon continued, "if you cannot marry Dr. Morrison, will you come with me to the school? Will you be nurse there?" The question was so innocent, so hopeful that Sarah's heart nearly broke. She knew that wouldn't be possible, that once Little Moon was taken away, they would likely never see each other again. "Little Moon," Sarah said carefully, "if I could find a way for you to stay here, with people who care about you, would that make you happy?" The child's eyes lit up. "You found way?" Sarah took a deep breath, making a decision that would change all their lives. "Maybe, but it would mean some big changes for all of us." "Are you brave enough for big changes?" Little Moon nodded solemnly. "I am Modoc. We are always brave." The morning arrived too quickly. Sarah had barely slept, her mind racing with the weight of the decision before her. When she entered the church hospital, she found Dr. Morrison already there, checking on patients with his usual quiet efficiency. Little Moon sat in her corner, but today she was alert and watching the door with obvious anxiety. Sarah approached Dr. Morrison, her heart pounding. "I've made my decision," she said quietly. He looked up from the chart he was reading, his expression serious. "And? If you're truly willing, then yes. For Little Moon's sake and perhaps for our own as well." Relief flooded Dr. Morrison's face. "Thank you, Sarah. I know this isn't easy for you. What do we need to do?" Sarah asked practically. "How quickly can a marriage be arranged?" "Judge Fairweather is in town today for the territorial court session. If we can get the paperwork together, he could perform the ceremony this afternoon. Then we'd need to immediately file for adoption papers for Little Moon." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Dr. Morrison sent his assistant to find Judge Fairweather, while Sarah tried to explain to Little Moon what was happening. The child listened with wide eyes, hardly daring to believe that her desperate plan might actually work. "You really marry Dr. Morrison for me?" Little Moon asked, her voice filled with wonder. "Not just for you," Sarah said honestly. "Dr. Morrison is a good man and we can help each other. But yes, partly for you, because you deserve a family and a safe place to grow up." Little Moon threw her arms around Sarah's neck. "My father in spirit world will be happy. He worried about me when he died." Judge Fairweather arrived at noon, a portly man with kind eyes who listened to their unusual situation with surprising understanding. "Can't say I've ever performed a wedding quite like this one," he admitted. "But if it means keeping a child from being sent away from the only people who care about her, then I'm honored to help." The ceremony was simple and brief, held in the back room of the church with Little Moon as their only witness. Sarah wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton garment, while Dr. Morrison had borrowed a clean suit from the town's banker. They exchanged vows in quiet voices, promising to care for each other and work together as partners in life and medicine. When Judge Fairweather pronounced them husband and wife, Dr. Morrison leaned forward and gave Sarah a gentle kiss on the cheek. It was awkward but kind, and Sarah felt a surprising sense of rightness about the whole situation. Little Moon clapped her hands quietly, tears of joy streaming down her face. "Now I have mother and father again," she whispered. The adoption papers were filed immediately, with Judge Fairweather expediting the process. When the territorial officials arrived that afternoon to collect Little Moon, they were met with legal documents showing that she was now the adopted daughter of Dr. and Mrs. William Morrison, residents of Linkville, Oregon Territory. The lead official, a stern man named Crawford, was clearly displeased. "This is highly irregular," he complained. "These children are supposed to be educated properly, civilized. My daughter will receive an excellent education right here," Dr. Morrison said firmly. "My wife is a trained nurse and teacher, and I can provide instruction in mathematics and sciences. Little Moon will learn everything she needs to know." Crawford looked skeptical, but the paperwork was in order, and there was little he could do. "We'll be checking on the child's progress," he warned before riding away with his disappointed assistants. That evening, the three of them sat together in Dr. Morrison's small house behind the church. It was modest but comfortable, with a sitting room, kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. Little Moon would take the smaller bedroom, while Sarah and Dr. Morrison had agreed that she would use the larger room and he would sleep in his study, at least until they became more comfortable with their arrangement. "So," Dr. Morrison said as they shared a simple dinner, "I suppose we should discuss how this household will operate." Sarah nodded. "I'd like to continue helping with the medical practice if that's agreeable to you." "More than agreeable. Essential, I'd say." "And Little Moon's education?" "I can teach her reading, writing, and arithmetic," Sarah offered. "And perhaps you could help with geography and science?" Little Moon looked back and forth between them, following the conversation intently. "What about Modoc things?" she asked suddenly. "Can I remember my people too?" Sarah and Dr. Morrison exchanged glances. This was sensitive territory, given the government's policies regarding Native American culture. "What kinds of things?" Sarah asked gently. "Stories. Songs. How to make baskets like my grandmother. The names of plants for medicine." Dr. Morrison leaned forward. "The medicinal plants interest me greatly. Your people had knowledge that could be very valuable in treating patients. Perhaps you could teach us some of those things." Little Moon's face brightened. Yes, grandmother knew many healing plants. I remember some. Over the following weeks, their unusual family began to find its rhythm. Sarah and Dr. Morrison worked side by side in the medical practice, and Sarah discovered that they made an excellent team. He was skilled and knowledgeable, while she brought a warmth and intuitive understanding of patients' needs that complemented his more scientific approach. Little Moon proved to be a bright and eager student. She absorbed lessons in reading and arithmetic with remarkable speed, but she also began sharing her knowledge of traditional Modoc medicine. She showed them plants that could reduce fever, others that helped with pain, and some that aided in healing wounds. Your grandmother was very wise, Dr. Morrison told her one day as she explained the properties of a particular root. This knowledge could help many people. The townspeople gradually accepted the unusual family. Some were initially suspicious of Dr. Morrison's marriage to the visiting nurse and their adoption of a Modoc child. But Sarah's skill in treating their ailments and Little Moon's gentle, intelligent nature won most of them over. One evening in late autumn, as they sat by the fire reading together, Little Moon looked up from her book. "Sarah," she said, "are you happy you married Dr. Morrison?" Sarah considered the question carefully. She had grown genuinely fond of her husband over the months of their marriage. He was kind, intelligent, and shared her dedication to helping others. While their relationship wasn't based on romantic love, there was a deep mutual respect and growing affection between them. "Yes," Sarah said honestly, "I am happy. Are you happy with our family?" Little Moon nodded solemnly. "My father in the spirit world told me in another dream that he approves. He says Dr. Morrison has a good heart, and you have healing hands like my grandmother." Dr. Morrison looked up from his medical journal. "I hope I can live up to your father's approval, Little Moon." "You already do," the child said confidently. "You saved my life when you let me stay. Both of you did." As winter approached, Sarah realized that what had begun as a practical arrangement to save a child had become something much deeper. They were truly a family now, bound not just by legal papers but by genuine care for each other. Little Moon was thriving, learning eagerly and slowly, healing from the trauma of her past. And Sarah had found a partnership and purpose that fulfilled her in ways she had never expected. But she also knew that their happiness was still fragile, still subject to the prejudices and policies of a society that didn't always approve of their choices. She could only hope that the love and determination that had brought them together would be enough to protect the family they had built. Winter brought new challenges to the Morrison household. The first snow arrived early, blanketing Linkville in white and making travel difficult for patients seeking medical care. Sarah found herself working longer hours as Dr. Morrison treated cases of pneumonia, broken bones from icy falls, and the various ailments that came with the harsh weather. Little Moon had grown several inches since her adoption and was becoming quite the young lady. At 9 years old, she was reading at a level that impressed even the town's schoolmaster, Mr. Peterson. She had also become an invaluable helper in the medical practice, her knowledge of traditional healing methods proving useful time and again. One particularly cold December evening, a frantic pounding at their door interrupted the family's quiet dinner. Dr. Morrison opened it to find Tom Bradley, a local rancher supporting his wife Martha, who was clearly in the final stages of labor. "Doc, the baby's coming and something ain't right," Tom said, his voice tight with fear. "Our usual midwife is snowed in up north and we couldn't make it to town until now." Sarah immediately sprang into action, helping Martha to the examination room they had set up in the house. One look told her this would be a difficult delivery. The baby was positioned incorrectly, and Martha was exhausted from a long, hard labor. "Little Moon," Sarah called softly, "please bring the clean linens from the closet and put water on to boil." As Dr. Morrison examined Martha, his expression grew grave. "We need to turn the baby," he told Sarah quietly. "It's going to be risky." For the next several hours, Sarah and Dr. Morrison worked together to save both mother and child. Little Moon helped by keeping fresh water heated and handing them clean cloths and instruments. Her calm presence was a comfort to everyone, including Martha, who gripped the child's small hand during the worst of the pain. "Tell me a story," Martha gasped during a particularly difficult moment. "Please, anything to take my mind off this." Little Moon began speaking in a soft, soothing voice about the Modoc creation stories her grandmother had told her. weaving tales of how the world began and how all living things came to be. Her words seemed to have a calming effect not just on Martha, but on everyone in the room. Finally, just before dawn, a healthy baby boy made his entrance into the world. Martha wept with relief as Sarah placed the infant in her arms, and Tom thanked them over and over again. "That little girl of yours has magic in her voice," Martha told Dr. Morrison weakly but gratefully. "Those stories helped me more than any medicine could have." After the Bradleys left with their new son, Sarah found herself alone with Dr. Morrison in the kitchen as little Moon slept peacefully in her room. They were both exhausted but exhilarated by the successful delivery. "We make a good team," Dr. Morrison said, pouring them both coffee. "We do," Sarah agreed. She had been thinking the same thing throughout the night. Their partnership had evolved into something seamless and natural, each anticipating what the other needed without words. "Sarah," Dr. Morrison said carefully, "I've been meaning to speak with you about something." She looked at him curiously. Over the months of their marriage, they had grown comfortable with each other, but there was still a formality to many of their interactions. "I want you to know that I consider myself fortunate beyond measure to have you as my wife," he continued. "When I proposed this arrangement, I thought only of the practical benefits. But you've brought so much more to my life than I ever expected." Sarah felt warmth spread through her chest. "You've given me more than I expected too, William. A home, a purpose, a family." "I was wondering," he said, his voice uncertain, "if perhaps you might consider making this arrangement more permanent, in the truest sense of the word." Sarah understood what he was asking, and she realized that her feelings for this kind, dedicated man had indeed grown into something deeper than mere partnership. "I would like that very much," she said softly. Their conversation was interrupted by little Moon padding into the kitchen in her nightgown, rubbing sleepy eyes. "Is the baby safe?" she asked. "Yes, sweetheart," Sarah said, pulling the child onto her lap. "Mother and baby are both healthy." Little Moon yawned. "Good. Grandmother always said helping babies be born was sacred work." As spring arrived, the Morrison family faced a new challenge. Agent Crawford returned to Linkville with additional officials, this time to conduct what he called a welfare inspection of Little Moon's situation. "We need to ensure the child is being properly civilized," Crawford announced as he examined their home with a critical eye. Little Moon had grown taller and stronger over the winter. Her English was now fluent, and she could read and write better than many adults in town. But Sarah noticed how the child tensed whenever Crawford spoke, her old wariness returning. "Show me your lessons," Crawford demanded, setting Little Moon's schoolbooks on the table. Little Moon demonstrated her arithmetic skills and read aloud from a geography book, answering questions about American history and government. Crawford seemed grudgingly impressed by her academic progress. "What about her other activities?" he asked Dr. Morrison. "We heard reports that she's been teaching people about Indian medicine." Sarah's heart sank. Someone in town had apparently been talking to the authorities about Little Moon's knowledge of traditional healing. "My daughter assists with our medical practice," Dr. Morrison said carefully. "She has proven quite helpful in caring for patients." "Indian superstitions have no place in proper medicine," Crawford stated firmly. "The child needs to forget such primitive nonsense." Little Moon looked up from her books, her dark eyes flashing with sudden anger. "My grandmother's medicine saved many lives. It is not superstition." "Little Moon," Sarah warned gently, but the child continued. "The willow bark tea that helps Mrs. Peterson's headaches, the cattail root that stopped Mr. Johnson's infection when your white medicine failed, these are not primitive. They are gifts from the Creator." Crawford's face reddened. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. The child is still thinking like a savage." "That's enough," Dr. Morrison said sharply, standing up. "My daughter is intelligent, well-educated, and helpful to this community. She has integrated her traditional knowledge with modern medicine in ways that benefit everyone." "Traditional knowledge?" Crawford scoffed. "Witch doctor nonsense is what it is." Little Moon stood up too, her small frame rigid with dignity. "My people were healing the sick long before white men came to this land. My grandmother could cure things your doctors still cannot. That is not savage. That is wisdom." Sarah watched proudly as her adopted daughter defended her heritage with such eloquence and courage, but she also worried about how Crawford was reacting to Little Moon's strong words. "I think," Crawford said coldly, "that this experiment has failed." The child is clearly not being properly educated away from her primitive beliefs. I'll be recommending her immediate transfer to Carlisle Industrial School in Pennsylvania. You cannot do that, Dr. Morrison said firmly. She is legally our adopted daughter. Adoption papers can be challenged if the child's welfare is at stake, Crawford replied. And I believe her welfare is very much at stake here. That night, after Crawford and his men had left for their hotel, the Morrison family sat together in their parlor, the weight of the threat hanging over them like a dark cloud. Will they really take me away? Little Moon asked quietly. Sarah pulled the child close to her side. We won't let that happen, she promised, though she wasn't sure how they could prevent it. Little Moon, Dr. Morrison said seriously, you were very brave today, standing up for your grandmother's wisdom. But we need to think carefully about how to handle this situation. Little Moon nodded solemnly. I understand. But I will not be ashamed of who I am or where I come from. My people died so that I could live. I owe them my memory. Sarah felt tears sting her eyes at the child's words, 9 years old, and already carrying the weight of an entire culture on her shoulders. It wasn't fair, but it was the reality they faced. We'll find a way, Sarah said firmly. Somehow we'll find a way to keep our family together. The next morning brought unexpected hope in the form of Judge Fairweather, who arrived at the Morrison house with a grim but determined expression. News of Crawford's threat had spread quickly through the small town, and many residents were upset about the possibility of Little Moon being taken away. Dr. Morrison, Mrs. Morrison, the judge said, settling into their parlor with a cup of Sarah's coffee. I've been thinking about your situation all night, and I believe there may be a way to protect Little Moon from Agent Crawford's interference. Please, Sarah said eagerly, tell us what you have in mind. The territorial legislature is currently debating new laws regarding Native American children and adoption rights. If we can demonstrate that Little Moon has not only adapted to her new life, but has become a valuable contributing member of this community, we might be able to set a legal precedent that would make it much harder for federal agents to overturn legitimate adoptions. Dr. Morrison leaned forward. What would we need to prove? Education, obviously, which you've clearly provided, but also community integration and contribution. I understand Little Moon has been helping with medical treatments using traditional knowledge. Yes, Sarah said. She's helped save several lives with her understanding of medicinal plants. Perfect. We need documented testimony from people she's helped. We also need character witnesses who can speak to her moral development and integration into civilized society. Little Moon, who had been listening quietly from the corner where she was supposed to be doing her mathematics lessons, spoke up. Judge Fairweather, what if the white medicine and the Indian medicine work together? Would that show I am educated in both ways? The judge smiled at her. That's a very wise question, young lady. Yes, I think demonstrating that you've learned to bridge both worlds rather than abandon one for the other could be very powerful. Over the next 3 days, Dr. Morrison and Sarah worked frantically to gather the evidence they needed. Tom Bradley provided a written statement about how Little Moon's traditional knowledge had helped save his wife and child. During the difficult birth, Mrs. Peterson wrote about how the willow bark tea had cured her chronic headaches when nothing else had worked. Old Mr. Johnson, whose infected leg wound had healed after Little Moon recommended cattail root poultices, visited personally to offer his testimony. The town schoolmaster, Mr. Peterson, wrote a detailed report on Little Moon's academic achievements, noting that she was reading at the level of a 12-year-old and could solve mathematical problems that challenged students much older than herself. More importantly, he wrote about her character, describing how she helped younger children with their lessons and showed remarkable maturity and kindness. Sarah also documented every medical case where Little Moon's traditional knowledge had been combined with modern treatment methods. The results were impressive. Patients treated with this combined approach often healed faster and with fewer complications than those treated with conventional medicine alone. But perhaps the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. Father Miguel, the traveling priest who visited Linkville monthly, had witnessed Little Moon helping during a smallpox outbreak the previous winter. Several families had been affected, and while Dr. Morrison provided the medical treatment, Little Moon had suggested using a tea made from elderberries to boost the patient's strength during recovery. The tea had indeed seemed to help, and not a single patient had died. That child, Father Miguel wrote in his letter, demonstrated not only knowledge but compassion and wisdom beyond her years. She has clearly retained the best of her heritage, while embracing the learning opportunities of her new life. To separate her from the family that has nurtured her growth would be a grave injustice. On the day of the hearing, the small courthouse was packed with townspeople who had come to support the Morrison family. Agent Crawford sat at the front with his stern-faced assistants, while Judge Fairweather presided over the proceedings with careful dignity. Crawford presented his case first, arguing that Little Moon's continued connection to her tribal heritage proved that the adoption had failed to properly civilize her. He cited federal policy requiring complete assimilation of Native American children into white society. The child still practices Indian medicine, Crawford stated. She still tells tribal stories and maintains beliefs that are contrary to Christian civilization. This is exactly the kind of primitive thinking that the boarding schools are designed to eliminate. When it was their turn, Dr. Morrison stood to address the court. Your Honor, we are not here to defend the failure of assimilation. We are here to celebrate its success in a new and better form. My daughter has not abandoned her heritage. She has elevated it through education and combined it with modern knowledge to benefit this entire community. He gestured to the crowd of supporters. Every person in this room has been helped in some way by Little Moon's unique combination of traditional wisdom and modern learning. She has not failed to assimilate. She has shown us a better way to assimilate, one that preserves valuable knowledge while embracing new opportunities. Sarah was called to testify next. She spoke about Little Moon's academic progress, her helpful nature, and her remarkable resilience in overcoming the trauma of her past. But most importantly, she spoke about what Little Moon had taught her. When I first came to Linkville, I thought I knew everything about healing, Sarah said. I had been trained in the finest medical school back east. But this child opened my eyes to knowledge that no school had ever taught me. She showed me that wisdom comes from many sources, and that the best medicine combines the best of all worlds. When Little Moon herself was called to testify, she stood straight and proud, her dark eyes clear and confident. Crawford tried to trap her with questions about her loyalty to white civilization versus tribal ways. But Little Moon answered with a wisdom that impressed everyone in the courtroom. I am proud to be Modoc, she said clearly. My people taught me to respect all living things and to use the gifts of the earth to heal the sick. I am also proud to be an American and a member of the Morrison family. They taught me to read and write and to serve my community. I do not see why I must choose between these gifts. God gave them all to me for a reason. Crawford tried one more approach. Don't you want to be with other children like yourself? Children who understand what you've been through? Little Moon considered this seriously before answering. The children at the boarding school would understand my sadness, yes. But Dr. and Mrs. Morrison helped me find my happiness again. They gave me a family and a home and work that helps people. Why would I want to leave that to be with children who are still sad? The hearing lasted most of the day, with witness after witness testifying to Little Moon's positive impact on the community. When it was over, Judge Fairweather announced that he would need time to consider all the evidence before making his decision. That evening, the Morrison family sat together in their parlor, exhausted from the day's proceedings. Little Moon seemed remarkably calm for someone whose future hung in the balance. Whatever happens, she said quietly, I want you to know that you saved my life, not just from the boarding school, but from forgetting who I was meant to be. Sarah felt tears in her eyes as she hugged the child close. You saved our lives too, sweetheart. You made us a real family. Dr. Morrison cleared his throat, his own eyes suspiciously bright. Tomorrow we'll know Judge Fairweather's decision. But regardless of what happens, you are our daughter, Little Moon. Nothing can change that. The next morning, Judge Fairweather called them back to the courthouse. The room was packed again, with many of the same supporters present. Crawford sat rigidly in his chair, clearly confident that federal policy would support his position. This case, Judge Fairweather began, has required me to consider not just the letter of the law, but the spirit of justice and the best interests of a child. After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence, I have reached my decision. The room fell silent as everyone waited for his words. The adoption of Little Moon by Dr. and Mrs. Morrison is hereby confirmed and strengthened. Agent Crawford's petition to remove the child is denied. Furthermore, I am recommending to the territorial legislature that this case serve as a model for future adoption policies regarding Native American children." The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause. Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief as little Moon threw her arms around both her parents. Even Dr. Morrison, usually so composed, wiped tears from his eyes. Crawford stood up angrily. "This decision goes against federal policy. I'll appeal this to higher authorities." "You're welcome to try," Judge Fairweather said calmly. "But you'll find that territorial law supports families who can demonstrate successful integration and community benefit. This family has done both." As they left the courthouse surrounded by well-wishers and supporters, little Moon walked between her parents, holding both their hands. She had faced down the threat of separation and won, not by abandoning who she was, but by proving that her heritage and her new life could exist together in harmony. "So what happens now?" Sarah asked Dr. Morrison as they walked home. "Now," he said, smiling down at little Moon, "we continue being a family, all three of us just as we are." 5 years had passed since the courthouse victory, and the Morrison family had grown in ways none of them could have imagined. Little Moon, now 14, had blossomed into a remarkable young woman who served as a bridge between two worlds. The small hospital had expanded into a proper medical facility, with Sarah and Dr. Morrison's combined approach to healing drawing patients from across the territory. The integration of traditional and modern medicine had become the cornerstone of their practice. Little Moon, now calling herself Moon Morrison while proudly maintaining her Modoc heritage, had documented dozens of traditional remedies and worked with her parents to understand their scientific basis. Their medical journal, which they had begun publishing 2 years earlier, was read by doctors throughout the Western Territories. One crisp October morning, a familiar figure rode into Linkville. Sarah looked up from the herb garden she and Moon had planted behind the hospital to see Agent Crawford dismounting from his horse. Her heart clenched with old fears, but she noticed that Crawford looked different somehow, older, more tired, and lacking the rigid arrogance he had once displayed. "Mrs. Morrison," Crawford said, removing his hat as he approached, "I wonder if I might have a word with you and your family." Sarah called for Dr. Morrison and Moon, and they gathered in the hospital's main office. Crawford looked around at the bustling facility, noting the mixture of modern medical equipment and carefully organized traditional medicines displayed in labeled jars. "I've come to apologize," Crawford said without preamble, his words surprising everyone in the room, "and to ask for your help." He paused, clearly struggling with what he wanted to say. 5 years ago, I was convinced that the only path to progress was complete assimilation. I believed that native traditions were obstacles to be overcome, not wisdom to be preserved. Moon watched him carefully, her expression neutral but attentive. "Since then," Crawford continued, "I've visited dozens of boarding schools and seen hundreds of children who were separated from their families. Some have adapted well, yes, but many have not. I've seen children who forgot their names, their languages, their histories, and found nothing of value to replace what they lost." Dr. Morrison leaned forward. "What changed your mind?" "2 things," Crawford replied. "First, I began reading your medical journal. The combination of traditional and modern healing methods you've documented has saved lives in communities across 3 territories. Several Army doctors have written to me specifically asking about Moon's documented remedies." He looked directly at Moon then. "But more importantly, I've seen what you've become. When I first met you, you were a traumatized child clinging to the past. Now you're a young woman who has honored her heritage while building a future. You've proven that assimilation doesn't require abandonment of one's identity." Moon spoke for the first time. "What do you want from us, Mr. Crawford?" "The federal government is reconsidering its policies regarding Native American children. There's a growing movement to support what they're calling cultural bridge education, allowing children to maintain their heritage while gaining modern skills. I've been asked to write a report on successful models, and your family represents the best example I've seen." Sarah exchanged glances with her husband. This was an unexpected development. "More than that," Crawford continued, "there are other children in similar situations to what Moon faced. Orphaned or displaced children who need families but who don't fit into the traditional boarding school model. Would you consider expanding your family?" The question hung in the air. Moon stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the town that had become her home. "There's a boy," Crawford went on. He's about 10 years old, from the northern Paiute tribe. His family was killed in a skirmish, and he's been living at the boarding school in Oregon for 2 years. He's intelligent but troubled, and the school officials don't know what to do with him. He keeps trying to run away. What makes you think we could help him? Dr. Morrison asked. Because you've proven that children don't have to choose between their past and their future. This boy, Joseph, he needs what Moon found here. A family that will help him honor his heritage while building new skills. Moon turned back from the window. What would happen to the other children? The ones still in the boarding schools? If we can demonstrate that this model works with multiple children, it could change policy for everyone. Instead of forcing complete assimilation, we could support families like yours who can provide cultural bridge education. Over dinner that evening, the Morrison family discussed Crawford's proposal. Moon had many questions about the boy named Joseph and what it would mean to have a younger sibling. I remember what it felt like to be alone and scared, she said thoughtfully. If we can help him the way you helped me, then I think we should try. Dr. Morrison was practical as always. We'd need to expand the house, and taking on another child would mean additional responsibilities for all of us. But think of what we could learn, Sarah added. Moon's knowledge has enriched our medical practice immensely. Another child from a different tribe might bring different wisdom. And, Moon said quietly, maybe someday there could be a place where children like us could come to heal and learn, without losing who they are. 3 weeks later, Joseph arrived in Linkville. He was a thin, wary boy with suspicious eyes and a tendency to flinch when adults moved too quickly. Moon immediately took him under her wing, speaking to him in the bits of Paiute she had learned from traders and sharing stories of her own early days with the Morrison family. The transition wasn't easy. Joseph had been at the boarding school longer than Moon had been when she was rescued, and he had learned to suppress his heritage more completely. It took months of patient work before he began to trust his new family and remember the traditions he had been forced to forget. But gradually, Joseph began to flourish. Like Moon, he proved to be intelligent and eager to learn once he felt safe. He brought knowledge of desert plants and survival skills that complemented Moon's forest wisdom. The two children worked together to create what they called the Bridge Garden, a medicinal plant garden that combined species from different tribal traditions with European herbs. Word of the Morrison family's success spread throughout the territories. Other families began inquiring about adopting native children using the Morrison model. Judge Fairweather, now elevated to the Territorial Supreme Court, worked with progressive legislators to create new policies supporting cultural bridge education. Agent Crawford kept his promise as well. His report to the federal government detailed the Morrison family's success and recommended policy changes that would allow more children to remain with adoptive families rather than being sent to distant boarding schools. On Moon's 16th birthday, the family gathered for a celebration that perfectly embodied their unique approach to bridging cultures. The dinner featured both traditional Modoc foods that Moon had learned to prepare from her memories of her grandmother and Sarah's New England specialties. Joseph, now 12 and much healthier, had contributed a Paiute blessing song he had remembered and taught to the family. After dinner, Dr. Morrison stood to make an announcement. Sarah and I have been discussing something, and we'd like to share it with both of you. He looked at his wife, who nodded encouragingly. We've decided to formalize something that's been growing naturally over the past few years. We want to establish the Morrison Institute for Cultural Bridge Medicine. Moon's eyes lit up. What would that mean? It would mean, Sarah explained, that what we've learned here about combining traditional and modern healing, about helping children bridge cultures, about building families that honor heritage while embracing the future, could be taught to others. We've received inquiries from doctors, teachers, and social workers throughout the Western Territories, Dr. Morrison continued. They want to learn our methods, and we think it's time to share what we've discovered. Joseph, who still spoke softly but had found his voice within the family, asked, Would there be more children like us? That's the hope, Sarah said. Children who need families, and families who are willing to love children exactly as they are, while helping them become who they're meant to be. That night, as the family sat together on their porch watching the stars, Moon reflected on the journey that had brought them all together. She thought about the desperate child who had whispered a desperate question about becoming a father's wife, and marveled at how that moment of pure hope had grown into something so much larger. "Do you think," Joseph asked quietly, "that our families in the spirit world are proud of us?" Moon smiled, remembering her own dreams of her father's approval. "I think they're proud that we found a way to honor them while building something new. We didn't forget who we were, but we didn't let who we were keep us from becoming more." Dr. Morrison reached over and took Sarah's hand, while she put her other arm around Moon, who in turn had her arm around Joseph's shoulders. They sat like that for a long time, a family that had been born from desperation but had grown into something beautiful and strong. The Institute would indeed become reality, helping hundreds of children and families over the years to come. But that night, under the vast Oregon sky, they were simply a family grateful for the love and courage that had brought them together, and excited about the future they would continue to build, one bridge at a time.